Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this EPC, European Foundation for Democracy, policy dialogue discussion, which today is looking at terrorist financing and how this has evolved and the challenges that emanate from this. This is a hybrid event, so welcome to the participants that are online. We're looking forward to having a great discussion today. Clearly, terrorists require money to operate, not only to carry out terrorist attacks, but also in the, let's say, the period prior to that in terms of radicalizing people into extremism, to bring them to the point where they would want to carry out a terrorist attack in the first place. And terrorists are obviously very cunning people, if I can put it that way. I mean, they're always looking for new ways to carry out terrorism, but new ways and new avenues to find the finance to support them in this process. And obviously, as time has gone by, some avenues of finance have been closed down. So new avenues have been opened up, and particularly sort of new technologies and whatnot in this respect. I mean, in some cases, some individuals probably don't even realize that they're financing terrorism. I mean, they may be wiring over $100 or something to a child in university, apparently, to pay for food or, you know, to go down the laundrette. But it's being used to pay for terrorism. So the process isn't always as clear as we may think. So we're going to be looking at this challenge here today, and we have a really stellar panel of experts to discuss this issue with us, and I'm going to introduce them now briefly. First of all, Mr. Ilkka Salmi, who's the EU Counter-terrorism Coordinator. Thank you for sparing the time for joining us here today. And he's with me in the room. Stephen Reimer, who is online. He's a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, also known as RUSI, in the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies. And his specialized subject is countering terrorist financing. Then we have Rebecca Schönenbach, who is the CEO of VETO for the rule of law. She's also online, so a warm welcome to you as well, Rebecca. And last but certainly not least is my colleague from our partner here today, Murat Seyrek, who's the Senior Policy Advisor at the European Foundation for Democracy, which has been working on countering radicalization and of all forms of extremism for many years. So he has a great depth of knowledge as well in this area. So welcome to you. Again, to the online audience, we want you to be part of this discussion to the maximum. So you can put your questions either by clicking on the hand icon or by typing them into the Q&A box that you can find, as always, at the bottom of the screen. So welcome to everybody. I want to start first by giving the floor to Mr. Salmi. We would like him to kick off the discussion by perhaps focusing on the evolution of the EU's efforts to counter terrorism financing. I mean, particularly since the 2015 Paris attacks, which was sort of I can call it a watershed moment in the escalation of terrorist activities in Europe, what's been done so far and what's been effective and what hasn't. So I'll give the floor to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's really my honor and a pleasure to be here. Apologies for my voice. I have a traditional flu, nothing to do with COVID, but I hope that my voice will carry not only in the room, but also in the digital world. So I personally do feel that the EPC and EFD plays a very significant role within the Brussels, discussing many policy topics, CT included. So indeed, I'm very, very happy to be here today. And again, I do believe that we all know that technology plays a significant role, not only in the terrorism financing, but also in the questions of radicalization and spreading extremist ideologies. Even if until today, I would say that we have seen few examples of financing of terrorist acts by new financing technologies, it's still quite clear that the terrorists use conventional means of payment, be it cash or intermediaries or money transfers. And then again, organizations such as AQ and Daesh basically still rely very heavily on very traditional and local means, and also use Havala still today. However, I would say that there is clearly a growing interest in the new financial technologies. And even if I mentioned it's not that widespread yet, I truly believe that it will become a more common tool in the very near future. And that's actually one of the main reasons why the new and emerging technologies is actually one of the top priorities for me and my office, so that we would really look into the serious risk that this could pose in the future. In this short presentation, I will say a few words, first of all, on the EU's measures indeed, and especially since 2015. Secondly, I will say a few words on how I see the current challenges or the current threats. And finally, I will conclude with few words on the future risks by the new and emerging technologies. So indeed, if we look into the EU legislative framework, one of the turning points was indeed the terrorist attacks in 2015. And since then, we have adopted the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive in 2018, where actually the EU already addresses the risks which are linked to the virtual currencies and anonymous prepaid cards. In order to avoid the criminals and terrorists that they could use the crypto assets to more easily to cover their tracks, the new AML CFT package presented by the European Commission in July 2020 pays particular attention to crypto assets. And the EU has aligned its regime on the FATF recommendations. Few words on the new regulation, which, as I mentioned, on crypto assets, it includes the AML CFT package, which will prohibit the provision of services for anonymous crypto asset wallets, ensure full traceability of transfers of crypto assets, and the authentication of their users. And there will be an obligation for crypto asset services providers to verify the accuracy of the payer's identity information and his payment account numbers from the first euro paid. Crypto asset services will be only provided in the EU by legal entities that have registered office in an EU member state and have been authorized by a national competence authorities. Again, during the ongoing negotiations on the package, the Council of the EU already agreed in June 2022, so a few months ago, that the new AML, or the Anti-Money Laundering Authority, would also be in charge of the direct supervision of crypto asset services providers. Then let me turn quickly to the current challenges we face. First of all, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have noticed an increased time spent online, and Europol, in its most recent TSAT report published in July this year, actually observed a growth of different financial means used online for terrorism and serious and organized crime, in particular by violent extremist organizations or individuals. It's very clear that even for the novices, actually, it has become much easier to launch crowdfunding and fundraising campaigns, and to learn how to use and transfer cryptocurrency and virtual assets through online tutorials. And the terrorists and violent extremists voluntarily use a multitude of small amounts through different online financial means to cover their tracks. There's a relatively recent example from France from September 2020, where actually the financing jihadist groups in Syria was used by cryptocurrency coupons worth between 10 to 150 euros, and which were purchased from licensed tobacco outlets across France. So this again shows the challenge that we are looking into a very small amount of money and not necessarily bigger amounts that used to be the case. Another issue, the founder of a case, the founder of the US Daily Stormer, a white supremacist website which inspired the perpetrator of the mass shooting in Buffalo in 2022, actually received at least $4.8 million in Bitcoin from its supporters, according to the report of the Associated Press and PBS on Frontline. Again, a French right-wing violent extremist made a donation of $522,000 in Bitcoin to 15 different causes and individuals, including to a US far-right and white supremacist who encouraged the Capitol attacks in January 2021. It's clear that even it is easier to create a profile on online platforms to sell merchandise like books, music, clothing, and video games related to violent extremist groups, and therefore to promote their ideologies and to reach a wider range of people, in particular the youth. Again, it's possible, for instance, to purchase on e-commerce platforms items sold by the right-wing violent extremist Nordic resistance movement, a movement which is very well known for someone like me coming from Finland. Again, in addition, the dark web is still a space where law enforcement services are facing difficulties to track and identify financial transactions related to terrorist activities. The use of cryptocurrencies in the dark web makes it even harder. Online gaming and video gaming platforms, which are less regulated and are gaining in popularity, could become more attractive for terrorists, financing, and money laundering. It is possible that with cryptocurrencies or prepaid cards to buy in-game currencies or items that can be then sold in a third platform to clean the money and then thus cover up the financial traces. And then briefly, just allow me to turn quickly to the future and some of the risks that we do see. First of all, the metaverse will also offer new opportunities for terrorists to use cryptocurrencies, given that they would be used more to holding digital assets. And it will be difficult to follow the money flows due to their lack of transparency. Terrorist groups could also organize crowdfunding campaigns and fundraising events in the metaverse with virtual music concerts and festivals, or entertaining to attract specific targeted people. They could also develop their own online financial ecosystems, which would operate in their own metaverse. And just to let you know that my office has actually drafted already a report on the metaverse, how we see that as a more general risk from the terrorism point of view. I would actually conclude by just saying one key word, which is basically the anticipation. I do believe that we should already reflect on the consequences of the misuse of new financial technologies by terrorists and violent extremists in order really to adapt as soon as possible our policies and legal frameworks, but also our technical response, which will be very challenging to counter these issues and to give really the necessary means to law enforcement and intelligence services, including the financial intelligence units as well, really to trace these transactions better in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salmi, for this very, I think, comprehensive and quite detailed opening explanation about what's being done. But maybe I could ask you a couple of follow-up questions. I mean, the first question would be related to the member states. I mean, are all member states taking this issue as seriously as they could, or are some further advanced than others? And the second question would be, I'm not sure if it's a question, maybe just a comment. I mean, is there a clear or 100% understanding of what actually constitutes terrorism financing? I mean, you could have, for example, I don't know, a bring and buy sale at a local mosque or somewhere else. I mean, how do you know where the money's going for that? Is that classed as possible terrorist funding? I mean, is there some clarity on this issue?
Thank you. On the very first point, actually, I have had lengthy discussions with I would say almost all of the member states as far as the new technologies and the financing of terrorism is concerned. And I do feel that there is a keen concern among the law enforcement and the security agencies in order to understand how they could also tackle these challenges that we face and trying to adapt into the, let's say, the new realities. Then again, having said that, the metaverse paper that we produced was among the first ones actually in the community where we really looked kind of comprehensively into this issue. So I think we still need to take a bit more forward-leaning approach into these questions and try to really understand. And that's exactly what I call for and did call for in the end of my short presentation, that let's now really look into the issues. Let's try to understand as much as we can. And actually, again, the aspect that it's technologically, it's very, very challenging. So we have to understand what are the means and tools to deal with that. The second question on what is terrorism financing? I mean, I think this is in the end, of course, a very tricky question, and especially if we enter into a pre-trial investigation or a prosecution to see again whether the money has been used or intended to be used for terrorist purposes. And I know again, for example, from the member state that I know best, that there has been court cases where actually the case has been dismissed on the fact that, it was not very clear where did the money end up in the end. And I think this is, again, getting even more challenging and more difficult when we speak about these very small amounts like 10 euros, 15 euros, 100 euros. Was that really meant for terrorist purposes? And if so, what is the impact? So I also believe that, we will see how the jurisprudence will what sort of a precedence we will have within the different member states.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to turn to you, Stephen, and just to follow on to what Mr. Salmi has been informing us about the EU's approach. I mean, do you think it goes far enough, or could they be doing more? And if so, what more do you think the EU could actually be doing? And what do you see the trend in terms of how terrorism is being financed these days? I mean, how is it evolving?
I mean, thanks, Amanda. Those are two really broad, difficult questions. So I'll try and limit my remarks, but I also just want to thank you and the CEP for inviting me on behalf of RUSI Europe, and as well as our Project Craft, which is all about the financing of terrorism and funded by the European Commission, to present some of our research and our views on this topic. In terms of how is the EU and how are member states doing on CTF, I would say that the picture isn't looking very great. This primarily has to do with the fact that neither member states nor the EU overall have really a good track record when it comes to risk awareness. Oftentimes our understanding of terrorism financing risk is either poor or it's highly reactive and responsive. So just to take two brief examples from the EU sort of level, the legislative package that was mentioned by Mr. Salmi earlier, it's a sort of a misnomer to call it an AML CTF package, because there's virtually very little in this package that gives us any kind of clear guidance on or sort of reactions to terrorism financing risks. It's essentially a money laundering, an anti-money laundering response. Which underlines a really unhelpful attachment we have to this 6-letter acronym of AML-CTF. We know that the Financial Action Task Force took up the mantle of dealing with terrorism financing immediately after 9/11. But these really are two very different sorts of threats, and I think require very different responses. I had a quick look this morning through the supranational risk assessment of the EU on, again, AML and CTF. And if you just go Control F and look at where terrorism financing risks supposedly lie, the risk assessment would tell you that it's in the trafficking of antiquities, it's in nonprofit organizations, as well as free trade zones and professional sports. From our research and understanding of the real terrorism financing risks in Europe, this is not where the core financing of terrorist activity happening in the EU is really going on. So again, I worry about our ability to really understand where risks lie. At the member state level, it's highly reactive. We don't have good capacities to identify where the majority of financing is occurring. We have to react to terrorist attacks and large-scale events in order to modify our responses. immediately after the Paris and Brussels attacks, for example, at the member state and then at the EU level, we had responses in terms of reducing the balances you could have on prepaid credit cards. We looked at some of the structures around how those payday loans are provided. These are some of the mechanisms that were used to finance those attacks. But in this, thankfully, relatively calmer phase of the terrorist threat in Europe, we're again sort of stagnant in our response. And really the terrorism financing and CTF conversation is at risk of becoming a real tick box ticking exercise, so to speak, whereby we look at the standards of the Financial Action Task Force and we seek to get a good grade from their assessors, and we sort of go along with UN Security Council designations, for example, and we fulfill our obligations to implement sanctions, and that's really about it. So that's kind of our assessment of what's happening at the EU and member state level on the response to terrorism finance. But perhaps I should have answered your second question first, which is about what are the risks from our point of view. I think when it comes to looking at risks, it's important to take this huge issue of terrorism finance and start to break it down a little bit. I like to divide it into organizational and operational terrorism financing. By operational financing, I'm talking about the financing of attacks, essentially. Europol and others are pretty clear, and there's pretty good consensus around Europe that the main operational threat facing Europe comes from lone actor attacks, or what we at RUSI Europe call self-activating terrorist attacks. Obviously, these are very simple attacks. They don't require much in terms of preparation. This is ground that's been covered many times before, but I think the point I'd underline here is that because we can finance terrorism with wage income, state benefits, and money that we borrow from friends and family, there's really no need for self-activators to revolutionize the way in which they finance these very banal attacks. And plenty of attacks require no pre-existing financing whatsoever. We're following closely the bits of information we're receiving and that are in the media about the Bratislava gunman and how he financed his attack. But I think it's very likely that this individual had pre-existing access to the weapon that he used to carry out his attack. On the organizational side of things, I think there is a bit more movement in terms of how individuals are supporting terrorist organizations that are either operating and domiciled in Europe or are domiciled and operating overseas. Here we see a few more sort of indicators that new technologies are being used, social media enabled crowdfunding most of the time, which really supports terrorist groups in terms of being able to access a wider audience than they would have been able to access if they were just using sort of old technologies, so to speak. But on the organizational side, it really does depend on the ideology behind the terrorist organization. And, Mr. Salmi referenced some of these points already. The Islamist extremist threat, the Islamist terrorist threat, those organizations really need to be very covert when it comes to their organizational financing. And oftentimes when they're soliciting donations from Europeans, they will use charitable pretenses to disguise the kind of activity that they're carrying out. This might be in an attempt to dupe people into donating to a cause, or it could be a useful cover for trying to throw off the scent that they might be giving to law enforcement and others. But the terrorist threat that is really growing, and we should all be the most concerned with, of course, is the far-right extremist and terrorist threat facing Europe. They can be incredibly overt with the way in which they finance their activity for lots of the mechanisms that were already mentioned, online crowdfunding or donations that come in fiat or cryptocurrency, but also the sale of merchandise, concert tickets. We've heard a lot of this stuff before, particularly from FATF reporting. Why are these groups able to fundraise so overtly? Well, it's because they're not designated as terrorist groups. In Europe, we have, I don't believe, any real terrorism designations for far-right groups, and member states are also pretty reluctant to designate far-right groups for all kinds of reasons. Canada, the United States, and the UK and other countries, for example, are sort of leading the way with those designations, but they may not necessarily be the best way of trying to deal with this sort of threat. I'll just make one last remark before turning it back to you, Amanda. I think when it comes to identifying the terrorist threat and its resultant financing, I think oftentimes we are sort of unappreciative of the global consensus we had around 9/11 and around the rise of Daesh as to what the terrorist threat was that we were going to collectively counter. Coming into the age where far-right terrorism and extremism is what we really need to be focusing on, we are completely lacking that global consensus. So I think that poses a huge challenge for the EU and for member states when it comes to how they're going to react to the financing of far-right extremism and terrorism, while still trying to deal with the Islamist and other ideological threats that haven't dissipated since.
Thank you, Stephen. An immediate follow-up question would be, I mean, what would you recommend should be the approach to these far-right groups? I mean, if we're not going to label them as terrorist groups, then what should we actually be doing to push them back?
Well, I mean, I think, and this comes to the last point I wanted to make in my intervention, but I'll say it now. I think we need to take counterterrorism financing and really turn it on its head. I think it's been pretty clear that it's very difficult to counter the financing of the sort of terrorist threat we have in Europe. We now need to think about using finance to counter terrorism. So, looking at the ways in which far-right groups finance themselves on online marketplaces or perhaps on social media, there's lots of pressure on the private sector and on those tech platforms to deplatform those individuals, to remove their content from platforms. And this is, a really missed opportunity for us to collect financial intelligence, to collect other sorts of information about not just the groups that are trying to fundraise and, support their activity financially through the sale of merchandise and other content, but we also miss out on the opportunities to find out who's purchasing this material. What are the networks that are established around the procurement of these sorts of goods? I really think we have to rethink the way in which we use financial intelligence to counter terrorism financing. And it might be more about looking at networks and mapping out the landscape than trying to prevent those terrorist attacks that cost very little and which do leave financial imprints and signals, but they're much more difficult to pick up on with the tools that we have at the moment.
Okay, great. Thank you, Stephen. I just want to remind the online audience that they can put their questions and comments by clicking on the hand icon or in the Q&A box by writing there. Please try and put your questions early, because we really want this to be a good discussion. So don't stay quiet. So I'd like to come to you now, Rebecca, to sort of hear your perspectives on this topic. I would also like to hear your reflections on the EU's approach, because I mean this is one of the main themes of this meeting, but also perhaps to tackle one of our sort of question in this discussion, and that relates to the crime terror nexus and how this plays into the financing of terrorism in different ways. So I'll give the floor to you, please.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and also for the invitation to both of your organizations and to my previous speakers, because they took the burden of me to set the grounds for the system of terrorism financing. Stephen touched already on one of the most important points, answering your question about the nexus of criminal and terrorist financing. One of the most, I think, difficult things to tackle is that we regard both fighting money laundering and terrorism financing as a compliance issue. So very, very often we have banks and supervising authorities like the FIUs and the different countries ticking off boxes, like checking the transfers, checking every transfer to Syria, trying to supervise the new technologies, be it video games or be it even social media financing, because one of the things that we see is not only crowdfunding, but we have not only the metaverse, but also platforms like Twitter enabling monetizing mechanisms where individuals can collect money for content that they post and so on. So there are lots of different new small, let's say on a smaller scale, possibilities for actors to collect money. There are, of course, the traditional ones, like as Stephen mentioned, renting a car with the money you already have or borrowing it from your cousin and then carrying out an attack with a car, or buying a smaller weapon, be it a knife or whatever, which is very cheap. But what we don't look at the moment, because we see it as a compliance issue, we do not really face the environment of terrorism, which is extremism. And that relates both to right-wing extremism and Islamism. So the biggest field in this to tackle is extremism, which is legal. So of course it is legal to express views that are not in accordance with our basic values within the European Union, but the financing of extremism is the groundwork of carrying out terrorist attacks. And there we see both. We see lone actors which just voice their opinions. We see that a lot in the right-wing extremism networks, be it incels or others. So kids or young adults expressing views on the internet, networking in chat rooms and so on, and laying the groundwork for somebody who then buys a knife and attacks women, for example, for being radicalized in an anti-feminist way. But we also see that on a much larger scale, and now we have this problem springing up into our faces with Russia. So state actors financing extremist propagandas, financing NGOs and so on, and all that is legal. And I do not think it is enough to just designate them as terrorist entities. And it would be very, very difficult also to do that on a legal basis. So what we have to do is to get away from just ticking boxes and think about methods to enlighten the dark field of extremism. To highlight the networks is one of the things that we should do, but the other thing is to think about not only transparency registers where we can see the benevolent owners of an entity, but also to make sure that any kind of entity, be it a political NGO, a religious institution like a mosque and so on, but also sports organizations and other avenues have the obligation to publish certain information from a certain point on. So for example, in France, they introduced legislation that you have to make public if you receive donations that are above 10,000 euros a year from one specific donor, or if your organization has a bigger volume than 250,000 euros per year, that you are obliged to publish your financial, your annual reports. That might be a way forward, because none of this is illegal and none of this automatically leads to terrorism, but it would show us who receives money from whom, who is interlinked with whom. And that's not only about the financial transactions. This is probably what Stephen referred to, use financial intelligence to counter extremism, but it also shows the network of individuals. So one of the other things that is not financial, but also would be very beneficial, is to ask the management board and the advisory board of organizations to publish their memberships in other organizations. So that is also something that has to do with due diligence, but it would enlighten a field of let's say, that is still in the dark. So if you look at cryptocurrencies, of course, you can oblige platforms and so on to publish the names of the individuals owning and transferring certain assets, but it will not give you an idea to what they're really up to. And this is also one of the things that is, of course, comes back to the question that you posed: what is terrorism financing? What is terrorism? So there are very few cases where we can actually pin down that an individual really wanted to carry out a terrorist attack, because that is difficult to prove. But if we do not only focus on criminalizing those actors, but on just highlighting the transparency, then we would get a really clear picture about what is going on in those circles, who is interlinked with whom, who is going to which conference, and so on. And of course, there's the difficult questions of data privacy. But on the other hand, if you have a political entity or a sports club organizing youth conferences and so on, it is something that member states should discuss, whether there is a need for more transparency and in which way this can be enabled to counter extremism financing.
But do you see, I mean, a reluctance or a lack of political will to have this sort of transparency, or for member states to, you know, pursue this?
It depends on the different countries. I mean, we have a very fragmented regulation still, although there have been steps, and I think they're really good to set up a system that for the EU that is the same in every state, but you have laws that, for example, the reversal of the burden of proof in the Netherlands, that is very effective, something very similar in Italy. So it's one thing is the law that is there, the other thing is the will to implement the regulations that is there. And we know from the Financial Action Task Force that has already been mentioned, who gives out reports on the different countries of their lack or their will to enforce regulations. We know that there are some steps that still I need to do. So for example, my country is Germany, I'm based in Berlin, is very, very reluctant to implement the regulation. That has also to do with our federal system. So there's some federal states within Germany where the offices that are tasked with giving out parking tickets have the task to set in motion the regulation countering terrorism finance. That is something that does simply not work. They're understaffed. So I think the will is not there, also because the internal threat, the risk assessment, like Stephen said, it's not really felt and seen. It's still a compliance issue. So as long as people see it as a compliance, we tick the boxes, we put in motion that banks have to have a certain set of monitoring, then the feeling is that we've done enough. What needs to change within the member states is to understand, especially with right-wing movements now, that it is the same phenomenon that resulted in a huge terrorist attack like 9/11 that could happen again if we allow this sort of extremism to lay the groundwork for radicalization. That this could result into something that will cost a lot of lives. And this feeling that it could lead to something that is very, very dangerous is not there. So the risk assessment, I think, must change within the member states. And there we have to do a lot. And I do not think that it is the right way to pressure, but the right way is to educate, especially the political entities in the member states about the risk assessment that they have to do.
I mean, it sounds like you're saying that, I mean, at least in Europe, in the EU, we became again, you know, quite complacent because there hasn't been a major terrorist attack for several years, because we all know how it goes. There's a huge terrorist attack. Suddenly it becomes a top priority to react to it and do some new things. But then time passes and we all slip back into this, well, not all of the same old things, but I mean, it loses importance until the next attack. I mean, this seems to be a very short-sighted approach, frankly speaking. It seems very.
It is. I mean, we all know. I know it's not a fashionable statement to make, but we all know it is a fashion. I mean, after 9/11, everybody agreed that Islamism is a huge threat. Our current government in Germany does not mention Islamism in the prevention of extremism at all, because there have not been any major Islamist attacks in Germany since the one in Berlin. So now, of course, the right-wing extremism is being highlighted, and rightly so, but then you forget about the other threat, and that, I think, is a very dangerous thing. So yes, it is about risk assessment. I mean, there's no gold in prevention. We all know that, yeah? So as long as we prevent terrorism attacks, and I think most of the police services within the EU, the intelligence services are very good at doing that. So we have major attacks being counted and stopped before they happen. And as long as this works, then the worries are not too high. But I think this is also why I highlight the extremism field, which is legal, because it results into terrorist attacks. And if we don't counter extremism, then we will see bigger terrorist attacks than we have seen. And also maybe on the high tech, or let's say the new technological field, which which has already been touched upon. I think one of the fields that we need to invest in is artificial intelligence to help us find some of the actors, because looking at state actors financing extremism and terrorism, they will have the ability that criminals already have to hire hackers, and they don't only hide the identities, but they mislead. And this is one of the biggest fears that we're going to face in the future. So hackers misleading authorities, misleading analysts in what is happening in the field of cryptocurrencies, but also in other fields like gaming and so on, not only hiding identities, but more or less giving false leads. And to counter that, we have to invest in artificial intelligence. There's some programs like in Israel, but also the Swiss military invested heavily in developing artificial intelligence to find out and to certain actors, but also to do a risk assessment in a very, very fast evolving field. And that might be one of the ways to counter also and highlight these fields, to get it from the dark into the light and to have more intelligence on what's going on in the networks.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'd now like to come to our, last speaker, last but not least, to you, Murat. Maybe we can change slightly the focus here, and I'll ask you to look a bit on the geopolitical dimension, how third countries are using these extremist groups in and around Europe to destabilize the EU. So this is an area where you have a very strong expertise in.
Well, I also wanted to talk about this because it's usually the missing element as well, because here in the city, we talk about the third countries when it comes to disinformation, propaganda, but then we are really missing the dots because same countries are usually involved in supporting terrorism and extremism in Europe as well. Because one fact is very clear, there are certain countries, they seek to destabilize Europe, undermine Europe. And of course, some of those countries are very obvious, Russia, China, and then some others are less obvious, especially for some EU policymakers. For example, suddenly it is more obvious nowadays Iran, because the country is supporting Russia, suddenly we have realized that, oh, maybe Iran is also a direct or indirect threat, and the list goes on. There are, of course, many other countries we can add. And I believe that we have been rather naive about many countries. Many European leaders somehow believe that we can engage with them, we can get engaged with them, we can establish good relations, and by establishing better relations, we can avoid confrontations and we can have normal economic, political, social, cultural ties with many countries. To a certain extent, this wishful thinking continues today as well. I mean, seeing Germany's position, the Chancellor's efforts to normalize relations and improve ties with China is also a prime example. A clear fact is we need to understand such countries and the regimes in these countries. They are not our allies. They don't see us as friends. They will never see us as friends. On the contrary, they see us as a threat. Obviously not as a military threat, but more a political, social, lifestyle threat, because we are sort of antithesis of what they represent and antithesis of the world they aim to create. I mean, with our liberal democracies, with our freedoms, we are a major threat for those regimes. And they hate us because they hate what we stand for. No matter what we do, this position will not change. That's why all this like charm offensives time to time from the European leaders, it's a bit, I feel like a pathetic effort as well sometimes. And our topic is terrorism and terrorism financing today. And some of you may wonder why I talk about all these countries and issues. I talk about this because it's also important to connect the dots and understand that some of these countries are also involved in supporting extremism and terrorism in Europe. Unfortunately, we don't talk about this enough, and in many cases, the link is not obvious, and they are using also some legal mechanisms as well to support extremism, including political parties in Europe. And they sometimes cooperate, coordinate, sometimes willingly, sometimes unwillingly, because they also have a lot in common. I mean, they seem to be very different, all these countries. Some are secular, some are Islamist, some are totalitarian, Christian, but they have one common enemy. They have common enemy, liberal democracies. And they've been doing, and they will continue to do everything to destabilize our countries, democracies, damage the social cohesion, target our free societies. And there are many different ways of doing this. And one of them is supporting extremism in Europe in order to divide the countries, our countries, from within. They want polarization, they want hatred, and they support all possible means targeting our social cohesion and the culture of living together. And how they do it in different ways as well, in terms of financing. The first layer is the legal one. I mean, as Rebecca mentioned, there's also a difficult one because they use our institutions, our universities, our think tanks, our NGOs. They create their own NGOs sometimes, their own institutions, and then they support them. This is, of course, nothing to do directly with the terrorist financing, but all these legitimate actions are eventually supporting their economic, political, social goals. And some of these legal entities are also used to support and promote extremist ideologies. And they also help to justify those messages of the extremist groups. And then there is a second layer. There we can talk about a sort of networking. So their embassies, their diplomats, journalists, companies, they are also actively engaged with extremist organizations and NGOs and also political parties in Europe. They invite them for trips, they provide trainings, they provide financing, scholarship, and in that way they create their own networks within our societies. And then the third layer is a sort of what I call gray zone, because there's also financing, and that includes the financing of these networks. As we know, this goes as far as financing some of extremist parties and groups, and sometimes they do it directly, sometimes they do it indirectly. And then we come to the fourth element, extremist and terrorism financing, and they're including today's topic, they also use technologies, they use different means, including crypto asset transfers to support extremism in Europe. And no need for ideological similarities either, because they are not really looking for this. They see it in a very pragmatic way, very simply the enemy of my enemy way. And this is also the logic of many extremist organizations in Europe. They are just perfect matches in that sense. They don't even question certain elements because, I don't know, for example, far left, they are usually very sensitive about LGBT rights, but at the same time, they are okay to receive funding and support from Russia. Or far right, white supremacists, Christian extremists, they don't mind establishing ties with the Islamic Republic. So this can be seen as a dilemma, but they don't see it in that way because they just believe that they should cooperate because they have a common enemy. And maybe the last point, how we can also tackle with this issue. First of all, we need closer coordination between regulators, monitoring authorities, enforcement bodies all around the EU. And we should do so by clarifying the responsibilities of these organizations, both at EU level, but also at member state levels. And we should be very clear about responsibilities of banks, financial institutions, and audit firms as well. I mean, not necessarily with bad faith, but sometimes they cannot connect the dots. Sometimes they don't want to deal with that, or sometimes it is just costly to deal with that in-house. It would mean hiring more people, more experts, and they don't do this. So I don't suggest to target banks, financial institutions, but they must understand their responsibility and we should make them a part of the solution. And we should also connect the dots in terms of connecting all these issues, because money laundering, terrorism financing, and nowadays also effective implementation of sanctions, they are all connected issues. In many cases, they are all used actively by such countries, by such regimes, as part of a broader strategy. But as long as we see all those issues as separate matters, I think it's difficult to address them. And then, of course, it's a complex matter. I agree. But the way to address this should not be making it even more complex by creating very complex mechanisms and procedures. So we need very clear guidelines, and then we should make sure that all member states follow them. Of course, it's easier said than done, and the new technologies are certainly making certain things much more complex, but this is seriously about the future of Europe. I mean, failing to implement such measures will effectively influence our future and will have consequences in terms of our social, political, economic stability. And this is also about the credibility of Europe as well. We cannot really let those regimes to use loopholes in our systems, gray zones in our systems, and we cannot let them use our systems for their own benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, Murat. I just noticed that a question has popped up here and from anonymous attendee for you, basically saying your theories are very interesting, but do you have any documented facts to support your statements? Maybe it's from one of those countries you were mentioning, as he's anonymous. So,
and I can imagine so. But these facts are sometimes so obvious that even those extremist groups and political parties, they agree, because sometimes, as it's in the case of France, you get loans, or in Italy, or in the case of some, for example, NGOs and political parties, it's very clear that, for example, in Germany, AfD, they were invited by Islamic Republic. Rebecca may confirm this. And in many cases, those examples are so obviously there that you don't need much documentation, because they are not even shying away from cooperating very actively and very transparent way, even sometimes, because they believe in this. I mean, and in certain cases, like in far right, sometimes they cooperate, for example, with an Islamist country because they have a common understanding of anti-Semitism. Sometimes it's purely pragmatic, as I mentioned. And in many other cases, it's also the way they finance and create their own future, because what they want to do is actually creating similar political systems here in Europe as well, more totalitarian, less freedom. So it is it's so obvious that we don't even need to prove in many cases.
maybe just a further follow-up question, because you talked about having stronger cooperation or closer cooperation between regulatory bodies and then better cooperation or forcing banks. I mean, is this something that's already been tried to do? I mean, why is there such a resistance to having this closer cooperation? I mean, can't it be, I mean, at least on the banks, to be enforced on them? Mm-hmm. And if it's not, why not?
I mean, as I mentioned, it's sometimes it's not that obvious, and banks are not there to sometimes understand the political links, security links behind certain transactions. And sometimes, as I mentioned again, I mean, they don't have teams to do this. I mean, they need to invest more. There's the same issue, I think, in the effective implementation of sanctions now against Russia. The rules are there. They are clear for all member states. They are clear for banks, financial institutions, but we don't always have the means to implement them. So that's probably the biggest challenge.
I'm going to open the floor to questions now. I can see that both Stephen and Rebecca have put their hands up, so I'm guessing you want to comment on some of the issues that have been raised. So, and Mr. Salmi. So I'm going to give the floor first back to you, Mr. Salmi, because I'm sure you want to respond to some of the points that were made vis-a-vis the EU's approach to start with. Then I'll come back to you, Stephen and Rebecca, and then I'll take some questions from the floor in the room. I don't see anybody else on the screen, so from the room.
Amanda, thank you. Actually, there are 4 points that I would like to raise, and very pertinent points made by my fellow panelists. First, the designation of a violent right-wing extremist groups or terrorist groups as a terrorist group in Europe, indeed, it has not taken place so far. And actually, normally the argument that I hear these days is that, well, we don't have such organizations or organizational structures that we could actually designate a specific organization. I don't fully agree with that approach. First of all, I do believe that we do have organizations also within Europe that we should look into very thoroughly, that even if we see these lone actors and people who are connected online or what have you, we still have entities that we could, and even individuals that perhaps we could designate. So just my point here is that my office and I personally are very keen, exploring this option, just to point that out. The second point on the transparency of different financial actions and financing of, be it the religious organizations or what have you, I think indeed one of the challenges that we have is a very different legislation in among the EU member states. So we do have countries, like Denmark, for example, or Austria, which have a certain laws in place to look into and make it transparent, this sort of financial transactions, while in some other member states it's deemed to be very, very difficult and even somehow, let's say, unconstitutional in going down that road, especially if you speak about religious entities. But I personally feel that this sort of transparency or some sort of a memorandum of understanding, at least with some of the actors who finance different organizations, might be an excellent idea. Then one thing that I have been advocating for is a strengthened or enhanced cooperation between the FIUs and the law enforcement and security services in order to understand the threat picture. Again, this is an issue in some member states. The FIUs fall under the Ministry of Finance, are more administrative bodies than really a part of the law enforcement, while in some others it's also very well embedded into the law enforcement system. So again, it makes things a bit tricky. And the same applies to this, let's say, nexus between the private and the public sector. When we discuss these issues, again, I do feel that this is something that would need to be done together. And then just my final point, and sorry to taking so much time, artificial intelligence was mentioned. And with that, we come to one of my hobby horses here, which is the question of privacy versus security, or the security versus privacy. And I think this is actually one of the things we all here in Brussels, we know very well that there's a very strong privacy lobby, and I'm also a true believer of fundamental rights, privacy included. But at the same time, I'm also a very strong believer that we have to have a very efficient security authorities which have would have a lawful access to different be it transactions or otherwise. So I hope that we can strike a balance, especially in the future, between the privacy and security, probably in a more security focused way than we have done so far. And artificial intelligence and the draft act thereof is certainly one of those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to give the floor back to you now, Stephen.
Thanks, Amanda. I just wanted to pick up on some of the points about kind of private sector engagement and the private sector's role in all of this. It's not that long ago where banks didn't really have to do compliance for anti-money laundering, and then not long after that they had to pick up the mantle of terrorism financing. And since then we've added on to the pile counter-proliferation financing and the implementation of sanctions. I think there's a real risk of overburdening and exhausting the private sector if we just kind of keep on outsourcing our kind of security concerns around things like dangerous kleptocracies, human rights abuses around the world, and just sort of expect financial institutions to be able to identify this activity, which we consider to be threats to peace and security, without really kind of involving them in the process. So I think, people talk a lot about public-private partnership, which I don't want to sort of, debate the merits of or the challenges of here. But I think Rebecca said it really well. Oftentimes from the financial institution point of view, these are issues of compliance. These are issues of not getting fined by your regulator and about meeting expectations. I think if we're really going to get serious about not just terrorism financing, but the financial nexus with all threats to both peace, security, as well as democracy, we need to really think about what relationship we're going to have with the private sector. Most banks have compliance staff that are, trained a few years before they, they enter that sort of role. And particularly given some of the huge money laundering scandals that have happened in Europe, banks are, employing tons of compliance staff, and there's so much demand for this sort of expertise. But I think there's a question to think about whether we should be trying to encourage financial institutions to have more of a defense and security angle to their compliance activity. Most banks don't have international terrorism or international security experts on staff. The people that do tend to have that are the virtual asset service providers or fintechs, who are really changing the game and how we do compliance and the nexus between finance and security. Lots of fintechs, not just in Europe, but like in the United States, particularly, lots of the bios of these people who are, chief compliance officer for a certain fintech will say that they used to be in the Treasury Department, or they used to be in the threat finance branch of a security agency. The financial institutions, legacy financial institutions, might start to think about adopting this kind of expertise, because if we keep going down the road we're going, where we rely on the banks to do more and more for us in terms of our finance and security issues, they're going to need more than compliance staff.
Okay, I'm going to open the floor now to questions in the room. I know we had a question from this side. Does anyone, and a question here. So I'll let you go first. And if you can say who you direct it to, or if it's for all of the panelists, and say who you are. Yes.
All right.
Yeah,
Great. It's working now. Okay. My name is Mohsen. I'm a freelance journalist based in Brussels, and I'm working currently for Independent Farsi. My question is to Mr. Salmi and also Rebecca. But before that, let me give you an example of our naivety. For years, we focused on Iranian high-tech nuclear facilities and enrichment, but what surprised us at the end was Iranian low-tech drones. Same story happening here. We are talking about cryptocurrency, high-tech, monitoring, but what actually happens on the ground is a very unconventional method of financing terrorism. In the case of Iran, I followed a work of fellow journalist Josh Meyer, who done extensive research in America based on US Treasury findings. And I followed his work in North America and South America, the marriage between Iranian-backed Jamaat al-Mustafa, which is a missionary, Islamic missionary in all over Europe, North America, and Africa, and its relation to drug cartels, for example. So I followed the same path, and I end up in the city of Antwerp, Aachen, and basically in a Benelux, in a second-hand car industry, if we can call it industry, and buying and selling, the terrorist cells, the Hezbollah terrorist cells, buying and selling this second-hand cars in the city of Antwerp, in Aachen, and another major cities in the region, and we cannot track any of this. It's impossible to track any of this. Yeah. So what is lacking here? A coordination, a network between the European countries, or we need a task force to tackle such a thing. The list is huge. I know Iranian IRGC has a massive crypto farms. Yeah, but when it comes to executing or killing one of my fellow citizens, I'm Iranian, so they're using Moroccan origin gangsters in Netherlands and paying them the couple of €1,000 to stab a guy on the street. So the reality is, like, we are either naive or we don't have the stomach to tackle all this. In another level, if we can see, like, for example, as I brought it up before, the investment in, for example, in a football team, we have it in the UK, we have it in Belgium. A lot of investors backed by IRGC, Iranian regime, are here. And as I mentioned, Jamaat al-Mustafa. So what is happening? Why we have it so much in Germany and all over Europe? Why this network is so untouchable in the name of religion, we are not going to investigate them. So what is lacking here? That's my major question.
That was for you, Rebecca, so I will allow you to answer.
Concerning the Mustafa Institutes, there you can see one of the problems in Germany with the federal administration. They're forbidden in 2 states in Germany, and they're allowed in the other states, for example, in Berlin. So there is an awareness about the danger of the propaganda they're issuing, also about their nexus to crime, but it's difficult to prove. And you see that what you mentioned now, second-hand cars being transferred to Africa are used as much to smuggle drugs and weapons as well. Very, very much related to Hezbollah, but also other channels of the Iranian system. I, for example, was transferred by a prosecutor in Berlin, a couple of hundreds of papers on this this car, say, industry, second-hand car industry. And first of all, this is also why I emphasize artificial intelligence to help solve these problems. You have about a couple of hundred names and they all sound alike. So first you have to know which family it is. Are they related? Are they not related? Is it the same last name? Because it can be spelled in a different way. They are Arabic and Farsi names. So we have to sift through all that. And then still it is legal to sell cars. So you have to prove the connection to the drugs. And it is not, let's say it's not easy. There are patterns that can be very, very well identified by artificial intelligence, where you know, okay, this kind of pattern, you buy a car, then you have a contact with this guy, you call this guy, and so on. That indicates there's a criminal activity. But then to prove that this is criminal, because the selling of cars is legal, if you don't find the drug, if you don't find the weapon, but you know that the proceeds are going into terrorist financing, then you have to prove that they're really directly related to terrorism. And that is very, very difficult, especially because it goes through several countries. So it's not that there is a lack in the knowledge. I think most of this is monitored very well. But as I said, it's the legal woods in which terrorism grows. So it's not easy to prove. And at the moment, we have to prove that proceeds are going directly into financing terrorism in order to prosecute those individuals. And that is still not easy to prove. So when there's a proof like drugs, you mentioned the drugs cartels in South America, then they're being prosecuted. And also there's a huge trial in Paris, for example, going on. And there will be a result, I'm sure, because you can prove that they transferred drugs. It's more difficult to prove the activities of the Iranian regime in terms of propaganda. You probably know that in South America, one of the most read online medias is from the Iranian state actors spreading propaganda. And it's clicked, I think it's the 3rd or 4th most clicked news source in South America. And that still also is legal. We know it's propaganda. We can prove it's propaganda. We can prove who's financing it, but still you cannot prohibit all of it. Yeah. So there's this issue of what is legal, what is not. We of course now Russia Today is one of those cases where it's prohibited. Might be interested as well to look at Iranian state-funded media outlets and think about prohibiting them. So there's a lack of maybe knowledge and political will. And just because it's linked to Iran, just to the first question to Demir, if there's a proof that state actors act in a way like networking and so on, yes, there are lots of proof. It's not only in the terrorism trials and in the drug trafficking trials. And most of the time, this is also one of the things I wanted to point out. Very, very often these actors are prosecuted for criminal activities, not for terrorist activities, because you cannot prove that the proceeds go to terrorist activities, but you can prove the criminal point. So at least they're being prosecuted on a criminal law basis, but you can't prove the terrorist nexus. But there's proof, for example, for the networking. There have been conferences in Tehran organized by the Islamist regime of Iran, where right-wing youth leaders of the AfD have been invited to conferences in Tehran, and there met the right-wing leaders of Russia, for example, Dugin. And that was not a single incident. So we have seen that again and again. So of course we have proof that they work on this level.
Thank you. Mr. Salmi, I think this question was also targeted to you, if you have a response.
Thank you. I think it was actually covered very well already, the replies and the challenges. Actually, one thing which comes back to the topic that we have already discussed, which is kind of the joint situational awareness or the threat picture. I mean, where do we stand? And indeed, in order to have that, we have Europol, we have Eurojust and the legal proceedings to looking into these very issues as well. And then again, I have been in the security business for 30 years, and I would say that we have made a tremendous progress in that respect of having a more, let's say, common view what's going on, and also the capability of changing information or exchanging information among the law enforcement and security authorities. But we still have to keep in mind that, of course, this sort of a traditional or legal cooperation, it always takes time. We are not a federal state, and very unlikely the EU will be not a federal state for a while at least. And this also has an impact on the way of exchanging information. So it comes down to the practicalities. And I think many of the issues that were already mentioned are absolutely true. Where to dig into and where the law enforcement security authorities would have then the right and the possibility to look into if it's basically a legal business, first of all, like selling secondhand cars. But then again, as I said, common threat picture is probably an extremely important.
Thank you. I'll let you put your question now.
Yes, thank you. I'm Anne Damiani from a journalist from Agence Europe. I have two questions. One about far-right extremism. You've mentioned link between some parties. You mentioned AFD with Iran or things like this, or Russia. But have you observed a link between terrorist, far-right terrorists in Europe and those parties that are legal? And since these parties receive public money, have you noticed that they are financing also some terrorist attack from them? And on the other, my second question was about more geopolitical links. How do we do when France, for instance, delivers arms to Saudi Arabia or Emirates, and we know that these countries actually finance terrorism? So what should we do? What diplomatic approach those countries we should have with those countries? Thank you.
Well, about far-right terrorist attacks, of course, we need to see the nature of those attacks as well, especially the ones in Europe, and that's why it is very difficult to obviously connect them. But what is important is in what sort of environment these attacks are happening, and in what sort of environment these extremist organizations, far-right extremist organizations in Europe are getting stronger and stronger. So obviously you cannot link any of those far-right political parties with those attacks either. If it was proven, then in any case, those parties wouldn't be able to be there officially. But point we need to see, and that's I think it goes back to one of those discussions about violent extremism versus extremism. The link is very clear in terms of legitimizing certain. So when we have those groups, legal ones, NGOs, political parties, and they are behind certain narratives, creating this hatred, creating this us versus them narrative. They are indirectly, obviously, creating the environment for those violent extremists and terrorists to organize those attacks. They don't do it by saying that you need to attack Muslims in Europe or Jews in Europe, but they create this hatred by years of discourse, repeated discourse, activities, by creating a sort of enemy within society, by clearly addressing and pointing out certain groups in society, sometimes migrants, sometimes religious ethnic communities. So that's about it. For the arm deals and other cooperation, I mean, it was also one of the issues I raised. I mean, this was even the case to a certain extent, of course, not the arms sales, but very close cooperation with Russia as well until very recently. And it still continues with many countries. Many German companies, for example, they are still contributing in the military industry of China. And even some parts of those drones, Iranian drones, we see many Western actually components coming from Western companies. So this is a major issue, yes. And we need political will to solve this issue. And I cannot even call this being naive, because I cannot accept that our leaders, our policymakers, they are not in position to understand the realities in this world. But I think we need to put a longer term perspective rather than short term gains. I think we are trying to do this as effective as possible with Russia nowadays. But also you cannot counter Russia by continuing to cooperating with some other countries. So that's something we need to understand and we need to implement.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions in the room? Okay, I know we've run out of time, but I would like to just to put one additional question to both of our speakers who are online as a sort of closing recommendation to each of you. If there was one thing that you could recommend that the EU needs to start to do tomorrow in terms of this cracking down on terrorist financing, what would be the key thing? And my last question to you, Mr. Salmi, would actually be related to the previous question that was put about Saudi Arabia, because I know that the EU has this counter-terrorism dialogue with various countries, and they also have these special counter-terrorism diplomats that are posted in various different delegations. I mean, if you could cite, one success story from this program, and I'm presuming there is at least one success story, what would it be? I'll give you the floor first, and then we'll go back to Stephen and Rebecca.
Excellent. Just very quickly, we do indeed actually, the External Action Service hosts a network of around 20 CT experts around the globe. I would say that if we look into the success stories in one way or another, at least it's raising the awareness. And one specific thing is that when we look into the situation in Africa, for example, we have seen that things have evolved and unfortunately actually deteriorated quite significantly in places like Mozambique. And I think the colleagues who are based specifically in Mozambique were the first ones also to let's say to raise the awareness among the actors in Brussels that we would need to look into that aspect as well. Just a specific point. All in all, I do believe that these people, they are really experts. They are not any sort of an EU agents or anything of that sort, but an experts who can really highlight the developments in their specific regions, and I think that's hugely important from the CT policy making point of view as well. Thank you.
I'll give the floor to you now, Stephen.
Thanks, Amanda. I think what the conversation overall shows is that we're really not in agreement as to what the threat really is. We've gone in 1 hour from right-wing terrorism to virtual assets funding Daesh to a very surprising conversation I wasn't anticipating to hear around Iranian malign influence operations. There's clearly no common understanding of where the risk is and where we need to focus our resources. So you asked for one concrete recommendation. I think the first thing I would ask us to do, either at the EU supranational level or for member states, is to decouple this anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing 6-letter acronym and look at the actual threats, financial dynamics of threats to peace, security, and democracy, whether that be designated terrorist organizations, malign influence activity, extremism, whatever it may be, and get specific on kind of what we're actually talking about. Because at the moment there seems to be lots of people talking about lots of different things, and in that space we certainly don't get any closer to concretizing and sharpening our response.
Perfect recommendation. Thank you, Stephen. So give the floor back to you, Rebecca.
Well, I would agree with Stephen that we do not have a sufficient understanding about the nature of threats, which is also why hybrid threats work so well to attack on different levels. So I would recommend to develop, and I think we're getting closer to this goal, especially on the EU level, to develop a holistic approach to the threat landscape and countering this threat landscape. And on a more practical level, I would recommend to introduce transparency laws, not only transparency registers, but also laws that enforce transparency for entities and also for the states. And that goes most of the time because the EU is already very good to publish who's being funded by the EU to member states. Because one of the things that we see is terrorism financing of state actors from the outside, but we also see a new development that more and more entities in the field of extremism, not terrorism, are financed by states, like like NGOs and so on. So it would be helpful if the member states would publish in a list that would be publicly available who's being funded for what, in which light, and so on. That would be on a practical level, my advice.
Great, thank you. And the last but not least, Murat, do you have a final recommendation?
Well, we keep talking about also new technologies and all this hybrid universe, but then as you mentioned, they're also still using actually very traditional, very simple methods as well. I think we shouldn't forget that while all these complex mechanisms and new technologies are used to support terrorism, still even like a cash money bring in by diplomats are also used very effectively, for example, to support extremist and terrorist organizations in Europe. So we shouldn't forget that angle.
I have to close the meeting. I would like to thank all of you for joining us today. I think that I agree with Stephen. We've had a very wide-ranging discussion. Probably all of these issues, requires a discussion in itself. So thanks very much to you, Mr. Salmi, to you, Stephen, Rebecca, and to Murat. Thanks for the cooperation with EPC. We'll be continuing to work together on this topic. I mean, we've been working on countering radicalization and all forms of extremism now for several years. So hopefully we will continue to do this into the future. To the audience, thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you at another one of our events. So everybody, please have a very good rest of the afternoon and evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me. Take care.
Thank you very much.